Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics for this event. My name is Chloe Hyman. I'm a history major in the class of 2020, and it is my honor to introduce our guest, Congressman Adam Schiff. Congressman Schiff is in his 10th term in the House of Representatives and is from Southern California's 28th Congressional District. As a leader in the Democratic Party, he currently serves as the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Under the Congressman's supervision, the Intelligence Committee has repeatedly shown its essential role in supporting American democracy, though we are not cleared to know even the half of it. Not so long ago, our guest led Congress and the country through the impeachment trial of President Donald Trump, during which the Congressman made significant contributions to the discourse in American politics while making the case that the president needed to be removed from office. In addition to a place in the pages of history books, these feats have earned the Congressman several presidential nicknames. Congressman Schiff has also served on the Foreign Affairs and Appropriations Committees and is a strong advocate of small businesses, human rights, the environment, and issues of American foreign policy. Prior to his time in the House of Representatives, Congressman Schiff served a 4-year term in California's State Senate, and before that worked as an assistant U.S. attorney. He foreshadowed his later career when, as an attorney in 1990, he successfully prosecuted the first FBI agent to be convicted of spying for the Soviet Union. The Congressman is a graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law. Today, he, in conversation with David Axelrod, will discuss pressing topics including congressional oversight, the role of government in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and upcoming elections. David Axelrod is a former advisor to President Obama and the founding director of the Institute of Politics. Please welcome Congressman Adam Schiff and David Axelrod.
Thank you, Chloe, and we wish you the best of luck. We were hoping to say goodbye to you and your class in person, but we can't, but I'm so glad that you could be here today. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for taking the time to be with us. We'd love to see you in person as well, but that's gonna have to wait. How are you doing, by the way?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, David, and thanks for having me. I really enjoyed speaking at the Institute. It now seems like another lifetime ago, but I think it was probably only about a year and a half ago. But it's a delight to join you again, even in virtual form. I'm here at the Capitol today. We're voting on a number of changes to the prior legislation to try to improve the functioning of the small business program, as well as on some FISA legislation. And appreciate the chance to catch up on the whole host of issues. We just had a rather moving moment of silence on the House floor, recognizing the 100,000 Americans that have lost their lives from the coronavirus.
So let's start there on COVID-19. You introduced some legislation to create essentially a 9/11 style commission to examine how we as a country responded to the threat of COVID-19. It's obviously it's a fraught matter right now because we're in the middle of an election, but there is a lot to be learned about how we as a country respond to these things. I imagine you've met with some resistance on this?
Certainly, but also surprising support. There are a number of different iterations of the bill that I introduced. Others have introduced similar concepts, and one was introduced by a group of Republicans. And so I think there's recognition among members of both parties that it's necessary to have a truly objective and nonpartisan review of why America was so ill prepared and why we are leading the world in virus and death from coronavirus. None of this needed to be the case. It didn't have to turn out this way. And I think we need the same kind of hard, cold, objective review that we had of 9/11 to figure out what went wrong and how do we protect the country better in the future. The bill that I introduced would not take effect until early next year, so it would put it after the election so it doesn't become a political football. I think the opposition to passage now, though, will come from the Trump administration. But that is the same as was experienced by the Congress during the Bush administration when the 9/11 Commission bill was proposed. George W. Bush was concerned it would be too critical of his handling or prevention of that attack. And likewise, I'm sure Donald Trump will be fearful of the conclusions that the commission will reach. But what propelled the 9/11 legislation is the same thing that will propel this bill, and that is the victims demanded answers. They demanded accountability, and I think that's going to be equally true here.
Yeah, and I think the thing about the 9/11 Commission was that it was geared toward trying to correct those things that went wrong. I mean, there was history and there was accountability, but there also was a look forward, and I think that's important here. You've also, you early on challenged the social media platforms for conveying information about COVID that was misleading or wrong and potentially dangerous. Now you have, I guess, an ally in this battle. I mean, the president's been provoked because he himself has been corrected by Twitter and now is issuing an order sometime today, we're told, that would change the liability of these platforms and give government more tools or encourage more of a policing of the decisions that they make. And I'm wondering how you process what he's doing in the context of your own concerns.
Well, you know, really, the view of that immunity provision, and we gave the tech companies immunity early in their existence when they were nascent industry, and we didn't want to stifle innovation. But over time, as we have seen a lot of the misinformation, disinformation, foreign propaganda efforts, et cetera, a lot of the ills on the platforms, we have had a running debate in Congress. Do we need to revisit this immunity? Now, many of us come at it from the perspective of we should revisit this immunity because the tech companies may not be acting like good corporate citizens. I'm particularly concerned with, you know, decisions by Facebook, for example, to allow patently false political advertising that you couldn't run on TV, but you can run on social media. The president comes at this from the completely opposite end of things. He's upset with any accountability, and so he's threatening social media companies right now, and that immunity provision, threatening to repeal it by regulation, which he can't do. And I think certainly people in administration know he can't do that. But he wants to try to bully them, which he's had a lot of success in doing. I think that part of the reason Facebook is loath to regulate political ads is that, number one, it's bad for business. They'd rather have all the advertising they can have. But number two, the presidential browbeating. They're worried about the president's ability to punish their businesses. Look at what the president has done to, or tried to do to Amazon as a way of punishing Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post. A $10 billion contract ended up going to Microsoft, and many are concerned, including Amazon, that cloud computing contract didn't go to Amazon because the president using whatever levers he can to censor people. You know, I don't know that I've called the president an ally on this issue, but I do think, frankly, that it's appropriate and necessary for the tech companies to be good corporate citizens. And when people are propagating false information that could kill people, bad information about health, the coronavirus, or other patently false information, they should do what they can to make sure that their users are protected.
Jumping back to COVID-19 and its origins, I mean, there's been a lot of debate about how it actually began. I'm wondering, first of all, how early did you see? Was intelligence shared with you about the virus early? I mean, when did you first see in the briefings that you got, or that you get as chairman of the committee, intimations of a problem?
We got written work product from the IC beginning at some point in January. And we had a briefing on it in early February. And right now we're doing essentially a deep dive on what did the intelligence community see? And how early did they see it? And what information did they share with us in Congress? What information did they share with the president? But we're also trying to view this from the broader perspective in which the IC, the intelligence community, is just one piece. Because a lot of what was shared with us from the intelligence community was what's called open source information. That is non-classified information that comes from places like the WHO, or comes from the Chinese government itself, or comes from doctors and scientists about what they're seeing. And so the information that we act on in Congress comes from a variety of sources. And in the health arena, the intelligence community is only one source of information. So we're looking at that right now to evaluate, were there enough intelligence resources directed at this threat? How do we need to reposition the intelligence community in the future to better perceive this threat? Is the IC integrated well enough with other agencies like the CDC and the NIH? Or is this a situation where there is a prejudice against what are considered soft threats, as opposed to hard threats like Iran or North Korea or Russia or China, such that it doesn't have the same resources devoted to that problem set? And so that's the analysis we're doing right now. I would also expect, frankly, that analysis to be done by this independent commission, that it will have a broader whole of government examination. So we were getting some information in January. We had a briefing in early February. And of course, a lot of the information we were getting was open source material.
You're in this peculiar position where a member of your committee is now the Director of National Intelligence, a former member of your committee who was a rather partisan member of your committee and carried a lot of water for the administration's point of view during the debates over Ukraine, for example, and impeachment. Are you concerned about the flow of information from the intelligence community to the Congress with a more political director of national intelligence? And you've had a little taste of it with Rick Grenell, who's been the acting DNI in the last several months and has been enmeshed in some controversies.
Well, I mean, Grenell is a political animal. He was essentially a Twitter troll before he got his appointment in the Trump administration, and has gone back to being a Twitter troll, and indeed, I think was even while he was the acting director. So he was catastrophic, not respected in the intelligence community, lacked the necessary experience for the job, overtly partisan. And I have to hope and pray that Ratcliffe will not follow that model. You're right, in our committee, he was an ardent partisan. He was a stalwart defender of the president, and he would engage in knowing what had to be knowing misstatements, knowing untruths to defend the president. I have to hope, because that's all we have at the moment, time will tell, that he will decide that is not his role as the head of the intelligence community. Now, we've had another member of our committee go on to positions like that. Mike Pompeo was on our committee. He obviously became director of CIA and now Secretary of State. He carried his partisan inclinations with him every step of the way and continues to. So he did not grow in the job. If anything, he grew more partisan. Time will tell with Ratcliffe what kind of acting DNI he ends up being. But I am very concerned, based on what's taken place up till now, that the intelligence community is not as forthcoming as it needs to be on matters of foreign interference in our elections, what the Russians are up to, and any other matter that the president considers either politically sensitive or at odds with the false narrative that he's trying to tell. And so I have a paramount concern, frankly, with information they share or don't share on coronavirus.
Well, the matter of Russia is a particular moment right now because we're 158 or something days from the election. I think 112 from when early voting begins. How active do you see the Russians right now, based on the intelligence that you've seen, and how concerned are you about our reaction to it?
Well, as you know, I can't go into the intelligence, but I can say, and I think, frankly, you can see this from what the technology companies themselves are saying, and I'm increasingly reliant on the technology companies to tell Congress what foreign powers are doing if we can't be completely trusting of the intelligence community to do so anymore. And what we're seeing is that the Russians have not stopped. They didn't stop after 2016. They continued to interfere, albeit in a lesser fashion in the midterm elections. And I think that they will undoubtedly continue to interfere. Certainly my opinion that their fondness for the president will remain the same. Their antagonism to anyone associated with the Obama administration, like Secretary Clinton or Joe Biden, I think will remain the same. And they've been given an open invitation by the president, effectively, every time he denies the facts of their intervention in 2016. The president was on the phone with Putin, I guess about 3 weeks ago, once again referring to the issue of Russian intervention in our election as a hoax. And of course, he's talking to the guy who was the architect of that intervention. And that's nothing, from my perspective, more than an open invitation to intervene again, as long as it's intervention that helps Donald Trump.
Do you have concerns about direct intervention in the actual vote count? That was not the case at least in an overt way in 2016. Now we have a situation where voting is very much up in the air because of the virus, and we don't exactly know, where we're going to be in terms of people's ability to go to polling places and so on. Does that add a layer of concern?
Absolutely, absolutely. And viewing this from the Kremlin point of view, they did two things in 2016, which they have, I think, an equal interest in doing in 2020. One is furthering the campaign of their favored candidate, Donald Trump, but also dividing America, playing along known divisions along race or gender or immigration status or other issues. They've been doing the same thing. They're going to continue to do the same thing. And now the pandemic is the great cleavage of all. That will be the cleavage around which this election turns. And given the fact that it may not be safe for people to vote in person, and that many states are very properly relying on a vote by mail, and the president is attacking that process, the Russians can accomplish two goals by interfering in the elections infrastructure. The first is they can help their favorite candidate, but the second is they can cause Americans to lose faith in their democracy and even cast doubt on the result. If the Russians intervene in the absentee balloting process, or they intervene in the voter registration databases or other means, and they cause Americans to question whether they can rely on the results, that confusion alone serves Russian objectives. So I think that the president has essentially planted a very fertile field for them by already questioning the results of the election. And we have to be, I think, even more concerned in 2020 than we were in 2016.
I want to shift topics here and ask you about what happened overnight with China and their crackdown on Hong Kong, the certification by the State Department that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous, essentially, or politically autonomous. What are the implications of that? You guys passed a bipartisan bill, I think, last year that carried with it a series of penalties if China were to infringe on Hong Kong. It seems clear now that they're doing it. What happens from here?
Well, I think this is a very serious matter, and I think the Chinese government is doing this under cloak of pandemic, both because they think that we and the rest of the world are really preoccupied right now with the health of our citizens, which we are, and the health of our economy, which we are, but also because the pandemic itself and the threat of the virus makes it very difficult for people to protest and gather in large numbers. So this is I think the Chinese view it as a ripe opportunity for them to crack down. What it calls on us to do, I think, is develop a strong international coalition to push back, to insist on the treaty fulfillment of the treaty obligations that China has, that there be two systems, that Hong Kong have the autonomy that it is entitled to, that people in Hong Kongers have the ability to associate and express themselves. And I don't think, simple statement by the Secretary of State along the lines that he made recently, threatening the trade status of Hong Kong, a simple statement is not going to do it. But I think concerted international pressure and escalating potential trade sanctions, such as Hong Kong's unique status as an ability to get sensitive technology. China can't obtain sensitive technology, Hong Kong can. China uses that, I think, as a end run around prescriptions on sensitive technology. So there are ways to start putting force behind our diplomacy that the administration should be exploring and working on with our allies.
Given the fact that we've sort of withdrawn from the international arena in many ways and created a vacuum in which China has moved, is it going to be harder to put an international coalition together now to act against China when China has essentially indebted a lot of players to it?
Without a doubt. This is a real cost of the decline of American leadership under this president. We have few loyal allies because this administration has dumped on them constantly. There's little trust in the leadership either of Donald Trump or Mike Pompeo. There's little willingness to go to bat for them. In fact, the president is so toxic among the populations in these countries and in our allies that it's politically hazardous for them to align too closely with the views of the administration. So it's been, I think, going to be much more difficult to accomplish. But this is an issue that should unite us with our allies. I think there's a harmony of interests here, but also there is a risk to the economies of our allies with provoking a fight with Beijing. And they need to know that we have their back in that fight, that we're not going to go south on them at the first sign of difficulty. And the administration's track record just doesn't give them that confidence. So yes, this is why China feels the freedom to act the way it is. The decline of American leadership hasn't meant that China's been treading water. They haven't. They've been using their wealth and their influence to win friends and buy friends, and posing a real challenge, I think, to American leadership, and one that we have not met.
The president, I'm sitting here in Arizona, you're from California, so you don't really participate in a national election, but I'm sitting in Arizona right now, so I see advertising because this state is actually in contention. And a lot of the advertising of the president has centered on China, and the rhetoric of the White House has become much more aggressive relative to China. And obviously, I mean, part of it was trying to suggest that China released this virus from a lab. But the bigger point is, between now and November, does this acceleration of aggressiveness, does it have policy consequences? Are we headed for perhaps an armed confrontation or some other fraught situation with China between now and November?
I think it has enormous consequences. How we handle our relationship with China will probably define the next century. And it's one of the reasons why I think we need to be very strategic about the fights that we pick with China. We need to be very careful that we're on solid ground when we do. China should be held accountable for their lack of transparency in the early days and weeks of this virus, when it became clear in China that there was human-to-human transmission of this virus. So China should be held accountable for its actions. At the same time, that's no excuse for our own failure in this country to control this pandemic, to respond the way the administration has. And when the administration starts to push out information that is either false, that it was a biological weapon, or pushes out information that is at odds or unsupported by the evidence, that or cannot be substantiated because it's a political value, that is the theory that the virus was an accidental release from the lab as opposed to a release, a transmission in nature. That, I think just muddies the waters about Chinese lack of responsibility and lack of transparency. After all, our own administration was saying that this was no worse than the flu. Our own administration was saying this was going to go away on its own. And so the president is in a very peculiar position to be criticizing China for its statements when the president's own statements have been so misleading.
Well, including the fact that his early statements were that China was doing an admirable job in dealing with the virus itself. Another theme that is emerging in this campaign, and you have been scooped up in it to some degree, is the president's branding of this thing called Obamagate, the notion that somehow the whole Russia investigation was a politically calculated effort to undermine him with no foundation. And as part of that, the release of your transcripts from your probe, the Russia probe of 2017-2018, have been used to try and support that argument, because there were members of the Obama administration, the intelligence community, who testified that they had no definitive evidence of collusion. How do you respond to that? And your counterparts across the rotunda are about to unleash a hail of subpoenas relative to this, to Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, and so on. Where's this all going?
Well, first of all, I would point out what's uncontested here, which is that the Russians interfered in our election in a systematic way. And they did so to help defeat Hillary Clinton, help elect Donald Trump, and to sow division in the United States. That's the unanimous conclusion of the intelligence community, of the Senate Bipartisan Intelligence Committee, certainly among the Democrats on the House Committee. The only outliers there are the president and Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee. But otherwise, there's no doubt about those fundamental facts. The problem with the argument that the government was out to get him, that the Justice Department, the FBI were out to get Donald Trump and concocted this whole Russia investigation to do that, is the investigation of the Russian connections, the Trump campaign, was going on at the same time as the Hillary Clinton email investigation. During the campaign, one was kept secret and one was not. The one that was kept secret was the investigation of the Trump campaign's illicit contacts with the Russians. If this was part of some government conspiracy to undermine the Trump campaign, they would have made it public, but they didn't. So there's a fundamental factual incongruity here. But in terms of what the investigation found on the issue of collusion, we're seeing basically a retread of Barr's effort to mislead the country when the Mueller report came out. They're basically at it again now that the transcripts of our investigation have come out, and that is pushing this no obstruction, no collusion line of thinking, when the reality is our transcripts show the same thing the Mueller report did, which is the Russians offered the Trump campaign help. They put that offer in writing. They said it was part of the Russian government's effort to help Mr. Trump, and the Trump campaign accepted. The president's own son and son-in-law, campaign chairman, met secretly to obtain help from the Russians. They lied about the meeting. The campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, provided polling data, internal polling data, to someone linked to Russian intelligence. I could go on and on in terms of the evidence of collusion, which is all there in black and white. But what they do point to as a hook for them are statements by Director Clapper and a couple others who were not part of the investigative team and who testified early on in the investigation about what they were aware of at the time they were still in their post. And I think, for example, Director Clapper, who they rely on left his post in early 2017, even before Mueller was appointed. So to rely on him as his statements about what he saw up until that point, I think is deeply misleading. But that's the whole point, to mislead and to distract from the mishandling of the pandemic.
You have been a target of some of the criticism after the transcripts came out. In fact, I got wound into one of those critiques just because of a conversation that we had back in February on my Axe Files podcast. But the gist of it is that you told the country on repeated occasions that you had seen evidence that was suggestive of collusion, and that because you had heard all of this testimony, that you were misleading the American people in order to tar the president. And I need to ask you how you respond to that.
Well, I respond to that in two ways. First, early in the investigation, we did see things that were non-public. For example, we found out that the Russians had approached to cut out Professor Massoud, George Papadopoulos, a foreign policy advisor on the campaign, and said that they could help the Trump campaign by the anonymous release of Hillary's hacked emails, stolen emails. That information was shared in April of 2016. That's before, I think, even the DNC knew it had been hacked. And so the Russians informing the Trump campaign that they had stolen material that they could help by anonymous releasing, and then they went on to anonymously release that. Yes, that's evidence of collusion, which I was not at liberty to talk about because it was non-public. But when that evidence started becoming public, when it became public, for example, that they had that secret meeting in Trump Tower and that written offer of help on dirt on Hillary Clinton by the Russians, then I started talking about the evidence of collusion in plain sight. And I told people in my interviews, as I told you, exactly what I was referring to, like these meetings in Trump Tower as evidence of collusion. And I think the reality is, in any courtroom in America, if you were being tried for the crime of conspiracy, these meetings, the provision of polling data, the secret email communications, all of that would be considered evidence of conspiracy, let alone collusion. So the factual predicate is certainly there. I think it's borne out by our transcripts as well as the Mueller report.
Although Mueller did conclude that there wasn't enough to prosecute such a case.
He did. Now it's important though, and the Trump team leaves this out, of course, Mueller said there's a difference between collusion and the crime of conspiracy and being able to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. He wasn't going to comment on whether collusion had been proven. And in fact, repeatedly, even before Mueller issued his report, I made the same distinction in interviews. I said, look, here's the evidence of collusion, and I itemized it. But whether that will be sufficient to prove the crime of conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt, that will be for Mueller to decide. And I said I would accept his judgment, and I have. So that I also made clear.
Hey, we're going to take questions in like 30 seconds from students, but I just a last one for me out of curiosity. Do you expect the president to pardon Paul Manafort and Roger Stone?
This president is capable of anything. So it's certainly more than possible that he will. Whether he will seek to do it before his election because he just doesn't care anymore, or after his election, or he'll decide that, I don't care about anyone except myself, and this doesn't help me, and therefore I'm not going to do it. I really can't say, but I can tell you he shouldn't. But the fact that so many norms of office are being broken by him, by the Justice Department, I mean, it would have been unthinkable in any other time with any other administration post-Watergate that an attorney general, at the request of the president, the urging of the president, would intervene in the sentencing of someone who lied to cover up conduct on the president's campaign, or lied in the case of Flynn and dismissed the case, lied about contacts with the Russians. And there, I think, David, is another illustration of collusion on the subject. Here is someone on the Trump campaign, now the designate national security advisor, having a secret conversation with the Russian ambassador to undermine US policy and lying about it. And the Russians apparently acting on that. I think for most Americans, that would be the very definition of collusion.
Let us take some questions. The first will come from Daniel Harris, who will return us to the subject that most Americans are thinking about right now, which is COVID-19.
Congressman Schiff, thank you very much for being here with us. My name is Daniel. I'm a first-year student in the college, and I'm actually right by you in Bethesda, Maryland right now. It seems that despite the best efforts of Congress, the PPP loan program isn't getting to every small business, and many of them have shut down or will soon have to. So I was curious if you think that Congress should suspend rent and mortgage payments across the board so that small businesses who can't access loans don't end up shutting down.
I think that there's really a better way. I mean, today, actually, one of the things we're voting on is to try to improve that small business loan program by reducing the requirement that 75% has to go to payroll. Because in some businesses, that's just not their business model. They have to spend more on rent and utilities, and they haven't been able to take advantage of the program because of that requirement. There was also a requirement currently, but we're changing today, that the funds have to be expended over an 8-week period, which was also not realistic. So we're trying to make that program better. But frankly, I think that there's a different approach that I've been advocating for a couple of months that is being used in Germany, in Britain, in France, in Singapore, in South Korea, in the Scandinavian countries, that makes a lot more sense. And that's a payroll guarantee that is administered by the government, where essentially the government guarantees 80 or 90% of payroll for all businesses, small, medium, large, sole proprietor, so that they can pay those bills, so that people aren't forced on unemployment. We're making a policy choice to rely on unemployment right now, rather than keep people connected with their jobs. I don't think that's the right policy choice, to have Great Depression levels of unemployment. I'd rather see the government subsidize that employment, keep them connected to their jobs until we get through this. The problem with a piecemeal approach, and we are in the HEROES Act that we passed 2 weeks ago, providing $100 billion of rental assistance. There are moratoriums at the state and local level, and some at the federal level as well, on evictions. But the problem is that when you enact those policies for renters, then the property owners can't make their mortgage payments. And when the property owners can't make the mortgage payments, then it dominoes to the lending institutions, and it creates a cascade of effects downstream, which is why I think the better approach is you have people stay in their jobs. Then they can pay their rent. You have businesses be able to stay open so that they can pay their rent rather than suspensions of rent. So we are trying to improve the program. We are including additional funding for rental assistance along the lines that you've asked about. There are put in place moratoriums on evictions and suspension of rent payments. But I think, frankly, the better and broader approach of a payroll guarantee that other countries are using is what we ought to be doing here.
You're right that those have been effective tools, and the government of Britain is a conservative government and embraced that as a more functional way of dealing with this problem. Hey, I want to read a question from ELISA Oppenheim, who submitted this in advance, and she said, and I hope you include the whole inspectors general issue in here and their decapitation as an oversight force, but do you think our system of oversight and checks and balances of the executive branch will ever return to normal, or at least become more functional?
It better be, and yes, I do. I have to believe to get through each day that this presidency is a complete aberration. It's our own Brexit from reality. But we are going to have to make law, not rely on norms of behavior anymore when this chapter is over, so it doesn't recur. I intend to include in the Intelligence Authorization Act this year a provision that you can't fire an inspector general except for good cause. Carolyn Maloney, the chair of the Oversight Committee, wants to do that for all the other inspector generals. We're going to have to insist on new mechanisms to ensure the independence of the Justice Department, for example, which is under great threat. So I do think we will get back to, when the pendulum swings back, a situation where we have oversight, where we have checks and balances that are functional again. But I have to say that what underpins this collapse of our system of accountability, what has allowed the president to willy-nilly fire inspector generals, to allow the Secretary of State to recommend the firing of an inspector general that was investigating him, and to allow the president to act on that without any repercussion, what has provided the underpinning for this collapse in accountability is the fact that one party in Congress has made itself a cult of the president and is unwilling to even defend its own institution. There are Republican senators who have made their careers on being ardent advocates of whistleblowers and inspector generals who are utterly mute in the face of this assault on accountability. We voted to establish and have established a select committee to oversee the pandemic funds, to make sure they're not going out on the basis of nepotism or cronyism, that the president can't punish states because their governors don't say nice things about him. And so we are doing what we can. And that has been a challenge in a pandemic era in which having hearings where you can subpoena people and force them to testify in open session is difficult. But we have now adopted a means where we can do this remotely if necessary through platforms like this one. So we will do all the accountability that we can, given the constraints we're operating under with one party as a cult of the president's personality. But when this presidency is over, yes, I think there will be a return to normalcy. There will be new laws to put teeth in these accountability mechanisms that the president has so willy-nilly trampled on.
Your presumption seems to be that that will happen in November. There's no guarantee that that's the case.
No, there isn't. At the end of the day, there's no substitute for the American people exercising good judgment and expressing their will at the polls.
Healthcare obviously is on everyone's mind right now because of the pandemic, and Sophie Hare has a question for you about that. Sophie?
Hi, sorry, I forgot to.
There you go, that's okay.
My name is Sophie. I'm a first year in the college and I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I was just wondering if you think we'll be able to make any bipartisan progress on the ACA as a result of the country's experience with the pandemic, and if there will be more public will to do so.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. You know, I don't know that I can say that that will take place this year, but I do think that the pandemic has done a couple things. It has revealed, obviously, the centrality of healthcare and the inequities in our system, the gaping holes in the system where people lack coverage. And I think it's also revealed that none of us are islands. If our neighbors are unhealthy, then we're unhealthy. That point can't be made more true than during a pandemic when the virus is no respecter of persons. So I think it's made a powerful case for universal health care. But I also think that we need to be mindful of how, after the Great Depression and World War II and other cataclysmic events in our nation's history, we have built back a better country, a stronger country, a more fair and just country. And we need to do that now also. So in the immediate term, we need to find out how we can address these disparities in access to care, which are killing people in the African-American community and other communities of color with just atrocious ferocity. You see places where African-Americans make up less than 10% of the population, but maybe 40% of the casualties of the pandemic. So we need to address this now, but we also need to be thinking about how do we build back better from this so that we don't have such inequities in healthcare, in education, the economy. We're trying to make changes in the small business program, for example, because minority businesses that already have difficulty with access to capital are being further hammered right now. We're trying to make allowance for the fact in education that poorer families that don't have tablets or computers or smartphones and don't have Wi-Fi may be cut off from education when we're in an online learning environment. And those disparities will be made even more worse and long-term. So we need to address these things now, but we also need to figure out how do we build back a better, stronger country. And I think there'll be a lot of momentum coming out of this crisis for universal care.
Thanks, Sophie. Our discussion of Hong Kong provokes this next question from Rahul Bura. Rahul.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, Congressman Schiff, for being here today. My name is Rahul. I'm first year here at the college. And yeah, I had a question regarding, again, the situation in Hong Kong. I was just wondering maybe where you're seeing the winds of Washington blowing right now in regards to granting greater special visa rights to individuals from Hong Kong. I know this is a relatively new development, but I was wondering if you heard anything yet in regards to whether visa rights over sanctions or in addition to sanctions on China is gaining any traction at the federal level. I know the UK is doing something similar right now, but I would love to hear.
I think there would be enormous receptivity to that idea, and I think there is. I think that though the priority has to be putting pressure on China to end its crackdown on Hong Kong so people don't have to flee Hong Kong. But for those that do, I think we need to make special provision. And I think there would be a lot of support for that idea. This gets back a bit to the question David had earlier about the long-term impacts on this. The fight now with China over the pandemic and how it will influence other issues. I think that the pandemic has not only provided cover for China to crack down on Hong Kong, but it also has escalated the impact of our interaction with Beijing over Hong Kong. Everything now will be looked at as a vector to attack Beijing, given the posture the administration is taking. But I do think the short answer to the question is that there would be a lot of receptivity to that now. And we'll have to see what response the administration wants to take. But I think also in Congress, there may very well be an impetus to provide that safety valve for people as well.
Thanks, Rahul. I have a question here that I'm going to read to you, Congressman, from Evan Hodges LeClaire, and it's probably one that's on the mind of a lot of students who are listening here. It is, would you consider extending unemployment insurance to apply to the many students that have had post-graduation job start dates delayed?
Well, I can completely relate to that question. My daughter just graduated from Northwestern, had the dream job lined up in New York and lost her job before she started. So she's in the same position as millions of other recent college graduates right now. And I do think we need to figure out how to help these young people, some of whom can move back in at home and some who can't. And some whose families don't have the wherewithal to support them. So, whether it's an extension of unemployment or it's the creation of work opportunities, targeting new college graduates, I think, for example, broadening efforts like the Peace Corps and Conservation Corps and directing them to do domestic work right now, like tracing. Like standing up the workforce we need to trace the path of the pandemic is also one important and viable answer. Now, that's not going to be a complete answer, but I do think the federal government ought to explore what do we do for the unique situation of people that haven't been working yet and therefore don't have the history that would entitle them to unemployment compensation. but would otherwise be entering the workforce right now. How do we keep them gainfully employed if we can? How do we provide assistance to them if we can't? So I do think that's a problem that Congress needs to address in one of those fashions, and maybe both.
I'm mindful of time because I know, apropos of the discussion of small business, you're going to have to cast a vote shortly. But we have another question here from Priyanka. Step up here, and it has to do with America's role in the world and what the absence of American leadership will mean. Priyanka, you there? There you are.
Yeah, thanks, Congressman Schiff. My question is that as recently we have seen, US has ceded this role of the world leadership. In case of the Mid East, we have seen, in case of the other policy issues like the climate change and this all, when the US is ceding this role, so what do you view that how the world would look like, whether the more nationalist issues will come into the fore, or in the future, whether the US will, in the near future, whether the US will again regain this position of the world leader? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, one of the last large group meetings I went to before the pandemic was early in February, was the Munich National Security Conference. And, meeting with, fellow parliamentarians from around the world and heads of state from around the world, there's no question about the sense of loss that's felt globally, the loss of American leadership, and what it means to them, but of course, what it means to us as well. The pandemic is a perfect illustration. Normally, not only would the United States be handling a crisis like this better internally, normally we would be the model for other countries to follow instead of the model other countries are looking to and shunning, but we would be leading the effort to deal with the pandemic globally. We're not even present. There was a multinational donor conference to help the developing world deal with this pandemic. We weren't even present. And so there's a real dearth of leadership right now. The result has been other countries are hedging their bets. And that means sidling up to China or sidling up to Russia because they're not sure they can really count on American leadership anymore. Now, I have great confidence that with a change in leadership, a change in the presidency, America can once again establish its leadership in the world. Without that leadership, I think you're going to see more chaos, disorder on a global scale, and certainly little leadership on issues like climate change. But it will take time. And for a long time, the rest of the world will wonder, even with very good American leadership, whether this period we've gone through of the Trump administration is a terrible aberration, is as I mentioned earlier, our own Brexit from reality, or whether it is like a virus that can recur in the future. And nothing but the size of the repudiation of this America alone, everybody else last kind of philosophy, nothing but the size of the repudiation and the passage of time, I think, will be sufficient to restore America's place and the world's confidence in American leadership.
As we said, and we may make this the last question, just so we get you out as promised. But the answer to your question again presupposes that there will be a change of leadership, and that involves an election. And Arturo Juarez has a question about that and the Democratic Party. Arturo. There you are.
Hello. Yes. Hey. Thank you, Congressman Schiff, for joining us today. My name is Arturo Juarez. I'm with the Committee of International Relations here at the University of Chicago, and I'm currently still in the city of Chicago, although I'm a current constituent of the 27th District of California. My question for you is—
how's the representation?
I'm sorry?
You don't have to answer that. Go ahead, ask your question.
Okay.
But it's my neighbor's district, so
yes.
he's free to answer that question.
I'll hold off on it. Among conversations with my fellow colleagues, many of whom are Democratic or lean Democratic, is a persistent concern that although we do not support the party platform of the Republican Party as it stands now, we are well aware of what it is. It seems it is clear-eyed, well-organized, simple, and widespread. However, we struggle to articulate succinctly in the same way we can for the Republican Party platform to describe what it is that the Democratic Party stands for. Do you think that the Democratic Party has a PR, marketing, or messaging problem? And if so, what is the plan, or how do you think it should do a better job of raising its platform and party pillars for the 2020 election?
Well, I think our party platform really ought to be, much as we were discussing earlier, about how we build the country back better, how we address these persistent inequities in access to care, the growing and yawning divide between rich and poor in the country, the middle class that's struggling to get by, the lack of equal access to jobs and a good education. This should be, I think, at the heart of the Democratic message. And it is in the platform. But you're right, we need to do a much better job communicating that in very simple, clear, crystal cut terms and contrasting that with what the Republicans are all about. Now, one of the challenges we've had up until the present is when you control the White House and you have one party leader, and that is Donald Trump, it is very easy to have a single message. Now, I have to say, the president makes it more difficult than he should, because so often he is so scatterbrained about what he's talking about. Right now, you would think the Republican agenda is Joe Scarborough and attacking him. And tomorrow will be something else. But there's obviously a strategy in that kind of distraction. But up until now, where we haven't had a nominee and we had a very wide open Democratic field and a lot of differing views on the direction of the party, it was difficult to have a unified message. Well, now we have a nominee. And it'll be vitally important for the Democratic nominee to set out a crystal clear agenda, not the lengthy party platform, which few people in the country will ever read, but rather, here's why I'm running, here's what I'm about, here's what I'm going to do, and here's why the guy that's there now is a disaster for everything you care about. So I understand the apprehension you've expressed. I think it has been very difficult in the absence of having a nominee to compete with a party that has a single leader and everyone else in that party subservient to that dear leader. But we now have a nominee, and there won't be any justification, rationale, or otherwise for not having a very clear and specific message. Let me say one other thing too, apropos of your question. You are now part of the most powerful demographic in the country. Young people, if you vote in your numbers, you can decide what this country does on healthcare. You can decide what we do on climate and the rest of the challenges to our global health. You can decide what we do in terms of affordability of college education. You have the power to do it. You have the numbers to do it if you use them. And there's no one who understands the technology right now of the day better than you do. Certainly better than anyone in my generation. So our speaker likes to say, know your own power. That's true of members of Congress. It's also true for individuals and generations. And you should know that your power is immense to bring about the change that you would like to see. So if you don't like anything in the Democratic Party platform, you can change it. And you can elect people who will further your vision for where this country should go.
Well, thanks,
Wonderful.
Arturo.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful place to end. Congressman, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. It's always great to chat with you, and I look forward to hearing more from you during what promises to be a really intriguing year. And best of luck in fighting through this COVID-19 crisis. Americans are looking at Congress and their leaders to provide some help, as you heard from these students today. So good luck in that enterprise.
Well, thank you. Great pleasure to join you. I really appreciate the opportunity talk with the students and faculty and look forward to doing it in person on the other side of the curve.
We look forward to that as well. Be safe.
You too. Take care now.